So far during this session, you have heard from my colleague Boaz an introduction on network industries, what they are and how they have both a competitive part and a non-competitive part. So this non-competitive part that my colleague talked about is what we usually refer to as the network part. In this next part of our session, I am going to give you some theory about why this network part is non-competitive. Well, rather the correct way to describe it would actually be why competition does not work for this network part. And I'm also going to give you some theory about how authorities should regulate it in the public interest. More specifically, I'm going to begin by discussing a concept which is very important for network industries, which is the concept of natural monopoly. I am then going to discuss several ways of setting network tariffs that have been or are usually applied by regulators. I will also walk in some details through all the components that regulators usually consider when setting efficient network tariffs. And finally, I'm going to discuss shortly the importance of having independent regulators. So I have now switched to slide 20. So I'm on slide 20. As I just mentioned, I will start this part of the session by discussing a concept which is very important for network industries, which is the concept of the so-called natural monopoly. This was also mentioned shortly by Boaz earlier on. And the idea here is that what natural monopoly means to an economist might be a little bit different to what you might think it means when you think of the word monopoly. However, I think you will find it very clear, and it is a very important concept. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on it. And in order to be able to discuss the concept of natural monopoly, I am first going to start by discussing a broader concept, which is the concept of economies of scale. And only then I'm going to move into discussing natural monopoly. Okay, I have now switched to slide 21. So we're on slide 21 called economies of scale. As I mentioned, I will begin by explaining the concept of economies of scale and then move into explaining how economies of scale interact with competition in any industry. As you can see on the slide, what economies of scale actually means, and by the way, I should add here that it is, so economies of scale is also known as increasing returns to scale. So what it means is that the more of a certain thing you make, the cheaper it gets. That's the simple concept. So economies of scale usually arise for goods or services where production involves very large fixed costs. So that big firms, will have much lower costs than small firms, and the reason for that is that they spread the fixed costs over more consumers or output. Large fixed costs are relevant for a very large number of industries, but the classic examples that we give here are R&D-based industries such as software or pharma industries, and then of course network industries, which is the focus, or is going to be the focus of this session. So for the case of the former, the large fixed costs are obviously given by the research and development costs required, while for the case of the latter, the large fixed cost will be the network itself. So to think about it more specifically, let's think of a piece of Microsoft software, for example. So the cost of developing the software, including all the IT work that goes into it, etc., let's say it may be around $1 billion, which basically means that the cost of producing the first unit or one single unit of this software is around $1 billion. However, once the software has been developed, the cost of a second copy may be closer to 1 cent, for example, and you're going to excuse me because I don't actually know how much the cost of a second copy would be. So I'm guessing maybe it's a little bit more than that, but it's just to give you an example. So the cost of a second unit will be very low. That is the idea, and that is the same for all the next units produced. So in other words, the more units of the software get sold, the initial large fixed cost of $1 billion is going to get spread over a larger number of units sold. Therefore, the more customers the company has, the cheaper it can sell the new software, right? And still recover this initial cost. And the same applies to pharma products. So the first pill or box, or whatever, however you want to think about it, of a certain drug may cost $1 billion, which will be related to all the required research and testing. Well, the next box may be produced almost for free. Of course, again, this is not really for free, but variable cost associated with producing these pills may be very low once the drug is developed. So again, this basically means that the more that gets sold of the drug, the cheaper it can be sold, and the easier it is for the company to recover the costs associated with the initial research. And finally, the same is the case for network industries. So let's take electricity for a second. And here, let's imagine a village where there is no electricity. Kind of a village in the middle of the woods, across the field, etc. So imagine you want to start by taking electricity to the mayor's house in the village. For this, you need to build the electricity wires. You need to drag them into the village from, say, the main wires that run along the main road. And these main roads may be some kilometers away from the village. Then you need to take them over a number of hills, fields, etc. So, you have the villagers working hard during days and days to do this, and take the electricity, take the wires to the mayor's house, and obviously this is going to have a very high cost. However, once you take electricity to the house of the mayor, connecting other houses in the village is going to become much cheaper, since it now only involves building some minimum wires to the other houses. So this is then similar to software or to pharma industries. The more houses you connect, the cheaper it becomes per house. So this basically summarizes the concept of economies of scale. And now I'm going to switch slide again. And I am now on slide 22. And now that I have explained you the concept of economies of scale, I am going to talk about how economies of scale interact with competition, and how competition may not work well in industries with important economies of scale. So first of all, when economies of scale are very important, the issue is that entrants cannot compete with incumbents because of the difference in cost. So if you think about it in terms of the examples we discussed in the previous slides, this makes sense. Because if you have one company that has already developed a certain drug, therefore it has already incurred the initial research and testing costs, this company can now sell additional units of the drug almost for free. Any entrant will therefore find it hard to enter, since it will not be able to charge sufficiently large prices in order to cover the huge initial investment required. And this is even more the case if the incumbent is a large company with a large established consumer base, because then the incumbent will be able to spread this initial large fixed cost over a large number of consumers and can recover this fixed cost even by selling at very low prices. Well, if the entrant is small, or if the entrant, say, does not even have a consumer base, it's going to be very hard to keep up. So what will happen usually is that this economies of scale effect is going to deter entry. And the market outcome may ultimately involve a small number of large or already established firms where market power may arise. Basically, what I mean by this is that if there's only a very small number of firms and there is not sufficient competitive pressure, these firms may be able to charge more than their costs and the reasonable return for these products. And I'm going to discuss in detail what cost and the reasonable return is throughout this session. So I'm not going to focus very much on those words right now. Or on the opposite end, however, you can also have the opposite outcome. So you can see from the description of economies of scale that it might actually be efficient to have just a single large company. Because if you have just a single large company, this large fixed cost is only going to be incurred once, and then the product can be sold to a large number of consumers, reducing the cost and then hopefully the price for each of these consumers, right? Instead, if entry does occur, the large initial fixed cost gets incurred a number of times, increasing the cost associated to servicing each consumer, assuming that you keep having the same consumer base. So the market outcome may also involve excess entry, which is having too many firms at too small a scale, making for inefficiency. Basically, the idea is that you can have either of the two problems described above. Either you have a very small number of large firms and no competition, either you have excess entry and inefficient application of costs. However, I would say that the first problem tends to be more common, and it is exactly what you've seen John Mill complaining about in slide 4, I believe I was with Boaz. But the other problem was also happening in the 19th century in London. In that case, and at that time, you had different companies competing for providing water supply services, each with their own pipes, and each constantly digging up the streets to lay more pipes, fix the pipes, etc. So actually, apparently, apart from inefficient, this was also just simply very annoying. And so we've discussed about two potential problems that may arise because of economies of scale. And you can, of course, try to fix those problems described. In the case of the first problem, you can try to force entry, and we will discuss later whether that is the way to go. Sorry, we will discuss later whether that is the way to go. It is what they did, however, in telecoms in the UK in the 1990s. So in telecoms in the UK in the 1990s, they basically wanted to have different companies competing for the telephone network. However, British Telecom, so BT, already had telephone wires installed. So what they wanted to do is to encourage the cable companies to compete with BT by installing a second network, so via the cable network, basically. However, in order to achieve this, what they actually had to do is artificially distort the market by banning BT from providing the cable service. And as for the opposite problem, which is, like I said, about excess entry, you can try to avoid excess entry by providing a fixed number of licenses, maybe one, maybe a small number, that will control how much entry you get in that specific market. And again, I'm going to come back to this a little bit more further ahead. So I'm now switching slide again. I am now on slide 23. Basically, what we have seen on the previous slide already is that there are two main problems associated with economies of scale. And the first one is that it may be hard to get competition, since an unregulated single company may be able to charge very high prices, but no one else enters because they know that the profits from serving half the market are not enough to cover the associated fixed cost or entry cost. And the second one is that in any case, competition may be inefficient and undesirable, since the free market outcome may see two companies enter the market if the profits do cover their costs. However, that may involve wasteful duplication of fixed costs. And the wise governments may still want to have a monopoly, which they will then want to regulate somehow to obviously avoid the excessive pricing issue, which would be to the detriment of consumers. So again, we will discuss this in large detail in the remainder of this part of the session. I am now on slide 24. So now that we have discussed the concept of economies of scale, which I said, it was the broader concept that we needed in order to then get into what we say really care about, which is natural monopolies. I am ready to now move on to this very important concept, which is the concept of natural monopoly. So here you can see the definition for a natural monopoly on the slide. Basically, a natural monopoly is a firm or industry whose average cost per unit of production falls sharply over the entire range of its output. Thus, a single firm or monopoly can supply the industry output more efficiently than can multiple firms. Therefore, I think what you can really see from this definition is that the natural monopoly is simply an example of economies of scale. So I will now go on to discuss further the concept of natural monopoly, and then I will also discuss how it applies to network industries. So I have now moved on to slide 25. And we have now discussed both economies of scale and the concept of natural monopoly. So this concept is very relevant for our discussion today because many network industries are prime examples of natural monopoly. And the reason for this is that in network industries, one of the necessary and main inputs is the use of a network in itself. And a network is a piece of infrastructure with very, very large associated fixed costs. And in the case of network industries, these costs refer to both the cost of actually building the network in the first place, so that would be an upfront cost or capital cost, if you will, but also to the cost of then maintaining this network, which would be an operating cost, but it would still be a very large fixed cost. So you can see a few examples of this on the slide. For example, for electricity, the network is made of all the transmission and distribution lines or wires. For natural gas, it is the transmission and distribution pipelines. For water, it is the water distribution network. For postal, it's the mailboxes and the rail sorting office. And for rail, the network is the actual rails. But then the question is, of course, what actually makes all these be natural monopolies? So I think for an easy example, we can focus on water distribution. Similarly to our earlier example of the village with no electricity, it's very expensive to lay a network of water pipes across the streets in order to bring water to a single house in the street. If, however, you connect to this network and bring water to 100 homes instead of one, the cost per home becomes about 100 times lower, because once you have the main water infrastructure in the street, you only need to lay, say, little pipes to each separate home. Therefore, the average cost of taking water to each house decreases the most houses you take water to. So this would be a natural monopoly. And obviously the same applies to electricity. Again, just think about our village example, to natural gas, etc. So I have now moved to slide 26. And so far we have learned about economies of scale and natural monopolies. And we have learned that network industries are examples of natural monopolies. So this brings us to what I like to call the so what part. That is, why do we care about all this? And the idea behind it is that on the one hand, you want to make sure that something that is a natural monopoly stays indeed as a monopoly. And on the other hand, you want to make sure that it does not charge excessive prices. Because as we discussed before, the issue with economies of scale, and therefore with natural monopolies, is that it might happen that you get competition where you don't want it, which would be an inefficient outcome. And if you don't, then what you are getting is market power, and that obviously comes with all the associated excessive pricing danger. So like I said before, you can solve the first problem by simply offering a single license to engage in all these activities. For example, offer a single license for gas, electricity transmission or distribution in any given geographic area. And here, when I say geographic area, it can be anything from a region to a whole country. Like, for example, what usually tends to happen is that electricity and gas transmission are being done by a single company across the whole country. So basically, you have a license, a single license per country, while for electricity and gas distribution, you tend to have different distribution companies in different regions of a country. So you'd have more than one license per country. That is the way it usually works. And then I think for other types of natural monopolies, you can think of something even larger for the geographic area, depending on what we're talking about. So for example, let's imagine we are talking about a gas pipeline that runs through different countries. In that case, you would want a large gas pipeline operated by a single company rather than 10 companies laying different smaller pipelines all over the place. So we're talking about licenses here, and obviously limiting the number of licenses that you offer for any given activity is, let's call it a legal way of solving the excessive entry issue. But one could also think of an economic way of solving it. And this would be mostly by setting tariffs for the incumbent in such a way that would discourage any additional entry. And we're going to talk about this in further detail a little bit later on when we discuss replacement costs, basically. So all this was with respect to not allowing excessive entry. Now, with respect to not allowing excessive prices, this is basically achieved by a regulation, and I will focus the rest of my discussion today on this. So we're going to get into it in quite some detail. Okay, which brings us now to slide 27. And as discussed for most of the remainder of my part of this session, I will discuss how to prevent natural monopolies from charging excessive prices, which would be to the detriment of consumers. And I refer to this as efficient regulation of network tariffs. So we start with it. I am now on slide 28. And in order to understand how to efficiently regulate network tariffs, we need to understand first what would be the aims of such regulation. And there is an obvious one that I have been mentioning a lot throughout my talk so far, which is to prevent excessive prices that the monopolist could otherwise charge due to not facing any competitive pressure. And that is the first aim that you see on this slide. However, that is not the only aim or objective of regulating network tariffs. So note that in the first place, most of these network industries can be considered, let's call them essential services. So both electricity and water are clear examples of it. Therefore, it is unlikely that you'll get a situation in which if consumers are not happy with the price, they will not consume. So there is an economic term for this, and what we say for this is that demand for these services is relatively inelastic, and therefore consumers will bear the burden of not only of any excessive pricing, which is the first aim written there, and that was discussed quite a bit already, but also of lower than desirable quality of these services. Therefore, in addition to keeping prices controlled, regulation also tries to achieve efficient operation of the network, adequate investment, promote quality, and any additional social and environmental goals. Because basically, and again, I stress the essential services thing that I just mentioned. Basically, on something like electricity, you don't only want to have low prices, and it's great if you have low prices, but you also want to make sure that electricity actually reaches consumers in proper conditions, that there's no constant blackouts, etc. So I'm going to move into discussing the other aims just a little bit more, particularly the second one. So with respect to efficient operation of the network, for example, let's say that you set, and we will discuss this in a lot of detail in a little while, but let's say that the regulator sets a price or a tariff that allows the company to recover costs and a reasonable return. So if the regulator does that price cannot actually be considered excessive. Cannot be considered excessive because the company is only recovering costs and a little bit of return. So it's not like it's making huge profits or what we like to call windfall profits. However, the question here is, what happens if these costs are too high, or rather higher than they are meant to be? So, what happens if the network is operated inefficiently? The price will barely allow the company to recover costs. So, okay, there's no excess profits there, great. But consumers will still pay more than they should, since the service could indeed be provided at a lower cost. Therefore, ensuring efficient operation can be just as important as keeping prices controlled. And the same can be said about ensuring adequate investment. So you want to, of course, give companies the sufficient incentives to invest in order to maintain the network in proper condition and reach as high a number of consumers as possible, like I said before. But again, you want this to be done efficiently, since any unnecessary investment will ultimately go out of consumers' pockets. And again, like any investment below adequate levels will compromise the quality. Therefore, like what I'm trying to say with this is that regulation is not a simple thing. So it needs to take all these objectives into consideration when designing tariffs and the tariff setting mechanism. Because just as there are a number of different aims or objectives, there are also, of course, different ways to achieve them, and some are better to prevent excess charges, and some are better for innovation, and some are better for ensuring efficiency, etc. So in this subsection, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a very quick first view of the various main types of regulation you can get and their various advantages and disadvantages. And I'll do this all at very high level, and only then we'll go a little bit further into discussion of tariffs. So I am now on slide 29, and by the way, apologies for the little breaks. I think so far the little breaks have been because I'm trying to check that this thing is still recording, so struggling here a little bit with technology. It seems to be working so far, and probably have some little breaks to drink water because this is quite long, as you can see. So apologies for that in advance. I am now on slide 29. So as discussed, I will now give an overview of the main types of regulation you can get in order to achieve the objectives we discussed before. And as you can see, there are three main types of regulation that are being used and have been used in the past. And these are cost plus regulation, which is also known as rate of return regulation, price cap regulation, sometimes referred to as RPI-X regulation, which has a variant which is revenue cap regulation, and finally benchmarking or yardstick regulation. So I will discuss all this in a little bit of detail now. I have now switched to slide 30. And I am going to start, as you can see, by discussing cost plus regulation. Basically, under cost plus regulation, the regulator sets the tariff that a company can charge by looking at the company's accounting costs and then adding a normal rate of return. So with respect to the cost of a company like the ones we are discussing, so basically network industries, costs can be related to things such as recovery of the upfront investment. For an electricity network, for example, this would be the cost of actually building, setting up the power lines. Then maintenance and repair of the network itself, investments in the network, as well as other operating costs such as employee salaries, for example. So I will discuss all these costs in further detail later on. And I will also discuss the normal or reasonable rate of return later on. However, as I mentioned before, regulation which sets tariffs in order to allow the company to simply recover its costs and the reasonable rate of return may well be useful for preventing excessive profits. So it is useful for preventing excessive profits. However, the question would be whether it has any disadvantage. And the answer is yes, because allowing a regulated company to simply recover or rather pass on all its costs to consumers basically provides the company with no incentives to keep its costs down. And this takes you a little bit to the main aims or objectives that we discussed before. So in terms of the objectives we discussed before, cost plus regulation would achieve the first one, which is to avoid excessive profits, but would not necessarily achieve the second one, which is to ensure efficient operation of the network. Therefore, what we're going to do is to look into other types of regulation as well and see if there are any that would be better at achieving this second objective. So I am now on slide 31, which discusses price cap or RPI-X regulation. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, the main concern with cost plus regulation is that it provides the company with no incentives to be efficient. Therefore, what RPIX regulation attempts to do is exactly to provide these efficiency incentives. And one way to promote efficiency on the cost side is to allow the regulated company to keep in its pocket any cost savings. So what this comes down to is setting a tariff, let's say any tariff, so we will discuss the details in a second, and allowing the company to keep any profits it manages to achieve from reducing costs. Now, while economics says that in principle this will make the company be as efficient as it can be, the issue with it is that if you actually allow the company to keep all these cost savings, you're not passing on any of these savings to the consumers. So consumers don't actually benefit in any way from the efficiency of the company. Only the company does. And first, like the only thing that does is to provide a windfall profit to the company. And second, if the ultimate consumers don't benefit from it, it is even unclear why you would even care that much about efficiency. So of course there are ways around this. And the main one is for the regulator to slowly start taking back any efficiency gains. The issue with it is that if the regulator takes back all efficiency gains, this brings us back to the initial situation. So let's call it the cost plus situation, if you will, where the company has no incentives to reduce costs. I mean, why would they bother to reduce costs if they don't even get to keep any of the savings? So there are different ways to deal with this, basically. The regulator can either allow the company to keep some gains but take some back, or it can allow the company to keep all gains but only for a certain period of time and then start taking back all gains achieved once that period expires, etc. So in the second case that I'm mentioning here, I should say just very quickly that obviously regulation normally happens in what's called a regulatory period. So maybe the regulator will set tariffs for an initial period of 3 years, and then it will set them in periods of 5 years each, or it will always set tariffs in periods of 5 years. You know, it doesn't really matter, but the idea is that some tariffs do get set and then they get reset after a while. So that's what I mean here with allowing the company to keep the gains for a certain period. Like, for example, you can allow the company costs, let's say, at the level they currently are at the beginning of the regulatory period. Then throughout the regulatory period, the company manages to reduce those costs. Obviously, it will get to make some savings and some profits because of it, because it was actually allowed revenues that reflect much higher costs. So the company there has incentives to reduce its costs. And then what the regulator can do is, not do anything about these gains during this period, but at the end of the regulatory period, set new costs, so allow new costs for the company, which are now lower. So basically, they reflect these incentives, these efficiency savings. So there are a number of ways to provide these incentives for efficiency and at the same time pass some of the gains to consumers. But in any case, and as discussed, the way to do that is ultimately by setting a tariff that is independent of what the company's costs end up being. And then such a tariff, you can either set it by, let's say, simply throwing a coin or running a random generator, or you can set it on the basis of some criteria regarding the company's cost or desired cost. And obviously the second one is to be preferred. And it's how tariffs are usually set under RPIX. So under RPIX, certain desired tariff is set based on the company's cost, and then it is then updated to reflect two things. One is inflation, which would be the I in the RPIX, since the regulator recognizes that the company's cost, whether or not efficient, will increase somewhat due to inflation throughout the years, or in any case they will change. And then the X in the RPIX, which relates to expected efficiency improvements. Therefore, the regulator is telling the company how it would like it to improve its efficiency. And if the company overachieves this, for example, it gets to keep any benefits from it. But if it does not, it may end up losing money. So imposing an efficiency path, so to say, has also prove useful in forcing the companies to become as efficient as possible. Because while setting any given tariff and maintaining it no matter what should in principle incentivize the company to keep costs as low as possible, in practice this does not necessarily happen, and therefore forcing a path is useful. So now I think the logic behind RPIX regulation is clear, and the question again is whether there are any disadvantages to it still. And naturally the answer is yes. So on the one hand, RPIX regulation gives the company incentives to reduce costs no matter what, therefore at potentially the expense of quality, you know, because why would the company invest in providing a high quality service when that simply increases its costs? And the reality is that in the case of a network industry, the type of efficiency that the regulator wants to achieve is not simply reducing costs, but reducing those costs that can be reduced without compromising other objectives, such as promoting quality. And on the other hand, RPIX regulation may lead to under or overcompensation for the company for reasons that go beyond efficiency or reduction of costs. So for example, if the regulator sets the X, so you know, the desired efficiency path in a wrong or unrealistic way, the company may never be able to actually achieve this path, and it may end up going bankrupt, which for essential services would definitely be to the detriment of consumers. Or on the contrary, if, for example, these RPIX tariffs are set on the assumption that volumes would be, you know, at a certain level, and those volumes end up being much higher or much lower, the company again may end up over or under recovering, which are, you know, for reasons completely unrelated to efficiency. I am now I've moved to slide 32. And on this slide, I discuss a variant of RPIX regulation, which is revenue cap regulation. And the reasoning behind revenue cap is similar to RPIX, with the difference being that instead of indexing the tariff to account for inflation and desired efficiency savings, what you index is the company's total revenue instead. And otherwise, you know, you allow the company to charge whatever tariffs it wants, as long as its revenues do not surpass what's suggested by this revenue index. So revenue cap does not solve the quality issue I discussed on the previous slide, but it does at least seem to solve the issue related to under or overcompensation due to market changes that lead to significant changes in volumes. And in this case, the question that you might be asking is why even bother with RPIX and not just always use revenue cap instead? And the reason would be that under revenue cap, the company will have no incentives to increase its customer base. So therefore the volumes it sells, so to say, because it will obtain the same revenue no matter what. And particularly for these essential services, there are certain less developed countries where increasing volumes or increasing the customer base is a very important concern, because you want, for example, electricity to reach as many people as possible. Therefore, which of the two types of regulation is preferable will in any case depend on the specific circumstances of each case. Okay, so I'm now on slide 33, which discusses the final type of regulation I mentioned, which is benchmarking regulation. So benchmarking is basically comparative competition, where the company's performance is compared to other companies' performance in similar markets. Once this is done, companies that perform better than the average across comparators are rewarded, and companies that do not are penalized. So similarly to RPIX or revenue cap, this provides the company with certain incentives for efficiency, since a company that is constantly performing worse than the comparator might go bankrupt, while a company that is constantly performing better than the comparator may be able to obtain important profits. Depending on the performance measure chosen by the regulator, regulated companies may have certain degrees of play in the way to achieve these efficiency improvements. So, for example, if the performance measure is cost per megawatt hour, a company can try to reduce these costs either by reducing investment or by reducing operating costs, for example. So again, this leaves us with similar issues regarding quality as RPIX or revenue cap mostly. So I'm now on slide 34, and we're moving into a new subsection, which relates to how to therefore set efficient tariffs for the use of a network. What we have seen from our discussion about types of regulation is that independently of what type of regulation you want to use, whether cost plus, RPIX, benchmarking, etc., a common concern relates to how to determine how much money an efficient company should get. And that is indeed the bulk of the work for any regulator, and it's what we will discuss in this next subsection. So I have now moved to slide 35. And what this slide shows is that there are basically two main steps for setting efficient tariffs for the use of a network. And the first one is the one I just mentioned and relates to determining the amount of money that an efficient company should get. And the second one relates to sharing this amount of money between the users of the network, so between consumers. I discussed this sharing, but very shortly later on in slide 50. However, I will say that that is not the focus of this session. And for the remainder of this subsection, what I will focus on is discussing how to determine this efficient amount of money. So from now on, I will refer to this efficient amount of money as a required or allowed revenue for the company. So I'm now on slide 36. And here I begin to discuss the required revenue for a network company and how to set this in an efficient way. The fundamental concept for doing this is that you want to set prices such that the company's revenues equal its efficiently incurred costs. And well, like I said before, plus a reasonable rate of return. So this could be considered a variant of cost plus regulation, but with a focus on efficient cost rather than on accounting or on all the company's costs. Therefore, under these circumstances, the challenge for any regulator, like I said before, is to estimate the efficient cost of running the network. And again, like I said, this is usually a very complicated job to do. But in any case, the underlying basis for it is that every year, tariffs should be set such that they would allow the company to recover a certain amount of return on capital. And like I said, this relates to the normal or reasonable rate of return I've been referring to earlier in the session. Depreciation of the network, and this has to do with recovery of the initial large investments that I've discussed before, and is known as return of capital. So we have return on capital and return of capital. Then the company should also be allowed to recover operating costs associated with running the network. And like I said before, these are, for example, maintenance and repair costs, salaries, etc. And it should also be allowed to recover any other costs such as taxes or corrections related to the company over or under recovering in previous regulatory periods, for example, due to unexpected changes in volumes that we discussed before, etc. So the idea behind, I'm just gonna stop just a little bit more on these corrections. The idea behind these corrections is that obviously when the regulator sets tariffs for, say, the next regulatory period, let's say it has a perfect way of determining what are efficient costs and what are not, so that's fine. But in any case, it still needs to forecast certain things. So it needs to forecast how much the company is going to be paying employees, and obviously that depends on their salaries, and their salaries may depend on things such as agreements with the government, by syndicates, etc., or simply, you know, on the way the economy develops, and the same for maintenance costs. I mean, it may be that these are clear, but it may be that the company will sign new contracts, etc. So there is basically, it is the case that the regulator could get it wrong, and not forgetting about efficiency reasons and allowing the company to keep efficiency savings, but for other reasons that have nothing to do with the way the company is actually operating the network. And the same way it can get wrong this cost, the regulator could also get wrong their forecast of volumes, which again may lead the company to under or over recovering their allowed revenue. So because of things like this is why corrections are allowed in the are allowed normally in this in required revenue, and they can be either positive, either negative. So for example, if the company over recovered in the previous period, they might need to give something back, or if they under recovered, then they might get an additional component in their required revenue for the next regulatory period. So all this that I'm describing here is shown in schematic form on the next slide. So I will now switch to it. And I'm now on slide 37. And this slide simply summarizes schematically what I discussed on the previous slide. So the right-hand column or image shows the building block of this required, or the building blocks, sorry, of this required or allowed revenue for the network company. You can see here the return on capital, the depreciation or return of capital, operating costs, taxes, and others, which in this case would be corrections. And the left-hand column shows the regulatory asset base of this network company. So basically what the regulatory asset base represents is the value of all the assets of the company. And finally, the figure shows the relationship between this regulatory asset base and the two building blocks related to capital recovery. So specifically, what the figure shows is that dividing the value of the regulatory asset base by the number of years the network is supposed to last gives you the depreciation that the company needs to recover each year in order to be able to recover all its investment in the asset base by the end of the lifetime of the assets. And note as well that any investments done by the company later on would form part of this regulatory asset base. So they would increase its value, and therefore they would increase depreciation that the company needs to recover each year in order to allow as well for the recovery of these additional investments. So basically tariffs each year, or at the very least tariffs for future regulatory periods, need to consider any additional investments that were made by the company that have not already been recovered through previous tariffs. And then finally, the figure shows that multiplying this regulatory asset base by a reasonable rate of return will allow the company not only to recover its initial investment, let's call it face value, but also to obtain a return on this investment. And this is necessary because this return is required in order to compensate the company for the passage of time and also for the risk entailed by investing in the first place. So I discussed in a little bit more detail later on. But what I will proceed to do now is discuss all these components or building blocks of the regulatory asset base in more detail. And I'm also going to discuss some of the issues that regulators face in determining each one of them. So I have now moved to slide 38. And here I begin to discuss the regulatory asset base. As you can see, I mentioned on the slide that there are usually two main methods used by regulators to determine this regulatory asset base. And these are to determine it based on historical costs or replacement costs. And I will explain what each of these are in turn, and also what is the main idea behind each of them. So the idea behind historical costs is that the regulator will want to allow the company to recover exactly what it spent for the network. And I say spent for the network because there are two ways to think about this as well. So a company could have spent something for the network by building it from scratch, for example. And obviously then after that, for all the additional investments done since the network was built from scratch in the first place. And I would call this, let's say, a pure historical cost. But the company could have also spent something for the network by purchasing at a certain point in the past a network that was already built, and then maybe doing any additional investments to maintain or improve that network it purchased. So this is referred to as an acquisition cost. And it is a reference point that obviously does not exist for all networks, and not all of them have been purchased at some point in time, but is nonetheless quite common since a lot of networks used to belong to the state and were then privatized, and therefore there exists a privatization price and that price the regulator can take into account when trying to assess what the company actually spent for the network. And then the idea behind replacement costs instead is that the regulator will want to compensate the company based on the hypothetical costs to replace or rebuild the network in any given year. So this is considered efficient in the sense that any tariff above this cost will not be worth it to consumers, as it would be cheaper to simply have a new entrant come in and build a new network rather than have consumers pay for the currently existing network. And finally, one other thing to consider is that currently existing network will most likely already be depreciated to some extent, since it would most likely have been built some years before the tariffs are being set. So therefore, it does not make sense for the regulator to allow the company to recover the full cost of a network, particularly since most likely this company already recovered some part of it. So, for example, in the case of an acquisition price, that acquisition price is basically going to reflect the cost of or the price rather, sorry, of an already depreciated to some extent network. And in the case of a historical cost, it's obviously not sufficient to know exactly what was spent on each component of this network, but you also need to consider how many years have passed and how much of this network has already depreciated, and or how much of the money the company that built it has already recovered. So there's the same. So for replacement cost is obviously a bit of a more synthetic estimate of the value of the asset base, but again, it does not make sense to compensate an already existing network with the cost of building an equivalent but completely new network. So that is the point behind looking at basically the already depreciated value of this asset base, and there is usually a rather simple way in which regulators determine this depreciated regulatory asset base, and it is to look at the number of years that a new equivalent asset base is supposed to last, and then look at the number of years that have passed since this asset base was built in order to determine the number of years that the asset base has left, if you will, and allow only the proportional part of the asset base that corresponds to these numbers of years that are left. So, for example, if a network lasts for 60 years and 30 years have passed since it was built, and let's say it was built for $1 million, then the regulatory asset base that the regulator would allow for tariff calculation would be equal to $500,000. And obviously there is caveats to this, and in practice it's not so simple, since an asset base is usually composed of many assets, and each of them with different ages and lifetimes. So a regulator would normally have to perform this exercise on an asset by asset basis. But the general idea behind it is this one. Sorry for the little break there again. So I am on slide 39 now, and oops, sorry, slide 39, as we were saying, and this slide focuses a little bit further on determining the regulatory asset base based on historical costs. So as I already discussed to some extent on the previous slides, there are different ways to apply the historical cost method. And one of them is to simply look at what was spent in actually building the asset base. And another one is to look at how much was paid to acquire the assets. So this would be the acquisition cost. One other way, which I did not mention, is strictly related to the amount that was spent to build the assets, but looks to index this amount based on inflation in order to reflect the loss in the value of recovering this exact amount of money, but later on in time. So when due to inflation, money is worth less. But in any case, all these look at not overcompensating the company by not providing it with more money than it actually paid. However, while determining the regulatory asset base based on historical costs may seem simple and intuitive, and perhaps more so than determining this hypothetical replacement cost, it is again not without issues. Because in many cases it is not actually straightforward to assess how much building the network actually costed. An example of this is related to ex-Soviet countries where the networks were built during Soviet era, and proper accounting of the construction costs may not be available. And there are also similar issues around acquisition costs, since many times the assets acquired do not relate specifically to the network for which the regulator is trying to set tariffs, but they can include other assets as well. So one example would be the acquisition of a gas company that is dedicated to both gas distribution and storage. And in that case, the acquisition price will reflect both the distribution and the storage assets, and it will not be straightforward to distinguish between the two of them. I'm now have moved to slide 40, and slide 40 discusses in a little bit more detail the replacement cost approach. And like I said before, under this method, the regulatory asset base is set at the level that it would cost to replace or build a new network that serves an equivalent purpose. And this gives rise to an important question, which is whether you actually need the whole current network to serve that purpose. So for a gas distribution network, for example, is it really a matter of replacing every single pipeline in the network by an equivalent one? Or could there be a more efficient way to lay pipelines and still service the same consumers with similar level of quality? And this is again particularly an issue for networks in ex-Soviet countries, which may not have been built necessarily keeping optimization and efficiency in mind. And you know, just with old networks in general. So therefore, an alternative to doing a simple replacement cost approach, which would look at the cost of replacing every single pipeline and every single transformer and everything in the network, an alternative would be to do what is called an optimized replacement cost. And this looks at the cost of a new entrant that would build an efficient network that serves the same purpose. The issue, however, with using the replacement cost approach in any case is that while sometimes it may be necessary due to lack of better information regarding historical construction acquisition costs, it is also a highly subjective and complex to implement exercise, and it requires significant input, significant cost research, and engineering assumptions. Nonetheless, the main argument in favor of it is given by the fact that the replacement cost method leads to regulated tariffs that reflect the cost that the new entrant would incur to build a network and compete with the incumbent. And therefore, any tariff set below this replacement cost could prevent efficient entry, but tariffs set above it may allow for inefficient entry. So this basically brings us back a little bit to what I was saying before, that the regulator may have different ways to ensure that no one enters if it really wants to do that. And one is legally, so for example, by providing licenses, but another one is economically, by setting tariffs that will deter inefficient entry. So in any case, the choice between historical and replacement costs for determining the regulatory asset base tends to be one of the big issues in many disputes, and was definitely one of the main issues in a massive dispute, which the award is now in the public domain, so it's okay if we talk a little bit about it. And it's a dispute between Naftogaz and Gazprom regarding gas transits through the Ukrainian gas transmission and transit system. And here, since the assets were built during Soviet era, Naftogaz was arguing that historical costs would not be used to determine the regulatory asset base, and it was proposing instead the use of optimized depreciated replacement costs. However, there were quite a bit of indication of what historical costs might have been, and this depreciated optimized replacement cost was way higher. And speaking of what is higher than what, I've moved now to slide 41. And as you remember from the previous slide, I mentioned the tariffs set below regulated tariffs that would result from the replacement cost approach may prevent efficient entry. And the question is around what is this efficient entry? So if the incumbent is able to charge tariffs below these replacement costs and still recover its cost and a reasonable return, we may not need this entry, so therefore it would not be efficient. And this would be the case, for example, if the incumbent build the assets at a lower cost than this replacement cost, or purchase the assets again at a lower cost than the replacement cost. And for example, in this chart, which refers to the Dutch gas transmission system, you can see that the replacement cost at a certain point in time is higher than both historical costs. So if the incumbent actually would have paid the historical cost, it would not make much sense to compensate them based on replacement costs. But rather you would just compensate the incumbent based on its construction cost. And this is often the case, and it's often the case even for the acquisition value, since the acquisition may many times be done under not so clear circumstances and at a rather low price, so again below the replacement cost. And in that case, the company may still have to be compensated based on the replacement cost approach. However, doing this would provide it with windfall profits at the expense of consumers. And this, for example, was the case for British Gas in the 1990s. It paid a certain price in privatization, but then expected to be compensated on replacement costs, which were much higher. And this is not, sorry, second. This is not the case in this chart. So on the opposite side, we have the situation shown in the chart, which relates again, like I said, to the Dutch gas transmission system. And here the acquisition value is actually above the value determined based on replacement costs, and therefore setting tariffs based on replacement costs would make economic sense, in the sense that consumers would pay the same price they would if a new entrant was simply to enter. However, it would not allow the incumbent to recover its investment, so in this case the acquisition value. And it is not very clear whether that would be fair, because, for example, it can be the case that at the time the network was acquired, it was more expensive for some reason, because of technological innovation or whatever, it was more expensive to replace the network, or simply the value of the network was expected to be higher because tariffs were expected to be higher for some reason. The tariff system was different, you can think of a number of reasons. And so basically the incumbent paid this cost, and it was necessary because privatization is desirable, and because people want to have gas transmission system now and not wait for like X years later when it becomes cheaper to build one, etc. So in that case, it would not necessarily be very fair to set tariffs at the replacement value, just because today it is cheaper to build another network, because basically you would again not allow the incumbent to recover what it paid for, and ultimately it would deter investment, because maybe the incumbent would go out of business, maybe not, but in any case it would definitely think twice, or anyone would definitely think twice about investing again. And finally, here, what I wanted to say is that with respect to historical construction costs, often it is the case that the replacement cost approach leads to higher value than this historical cost, but this is not, however, the case for telecoms, and exactly because of the effect that I talked about before, but that in telecoms is much stronger. So in telecoms, the replacement cost tends to be very low, because over time it becomes much cheaper to build a new network due to technological innovation. So again, this makes it rather harsh to compensate the incumbent based on replacement costs, since they will never be able to recover their initial investment. And so I have now moved to slide 42, and this is going to end our discussion on the regulatory asset base. So this chart simply summarizes the approach used to determine this regulatory asset base in a few European countries. As you see here, there is a little bit of everything. So Ireland, Italy, and Germany use historical build costs, so let's call them pure historical costs, though most of them are indexed. UK, France, and Denmark use acquisition value. Though, as you see in the case of Denmark, this is still basically pure historical costs in disguise, because this acquisition value is set based on the net book value of the assets plus a little margin. And Finland, Sweden, and Belgium use replacement costs. And note that they actually do not apply any optimization factor, but rather just look at replicating the network as it is. So now that we've discussed the regulatory asset base, I now move to slide 43. And you will remember that when we discussed slide 37, which was the one with the chart and then the building blocks, the regulatory asset base in blue, etc., I discussed what goes into the left-hand blue block, which is the regulatory asset base, and then I made reference to the fact that it includes both the initial assets as they are. So, for example, when tariffs are first set and the asset base is first determined, and any additional investments made ever since. And that is the main idea of this slide. So normally what happens is that regulatory periods go, like I said, for a predetermined number of years, and like 3 or 5 or whatever, and here there are two questions. So the first one would be what happens with the asset base during the regulatory period, and how should tariffs reflect this? And the second one is how to determine the regulatory asset base at the beginning of the next regulatory period. And sorry, I actually said before that that's the previous slide ended our discussion about the regulatory asset base, but no, this one is also about it. So for the first question, the answer is usually easy. A regulator will look at the start asset base that is determined at the beginning of the regulatory period, either based on historical or replacement cost, or however it did it. And it will update it to take into consideration the fact that it will lose some value every year due to depreciation of the assets within it, and it may gain some value every year due to investments. So for the second question, particularly in the case of asset bases determined based on replacement costs, a regulator could consider the possibility of determining the replacement cost at the beginning of each regulatory period. However, since, like I said, this is a hugely complex exercise, what usually happens is that the regulatory asset base is set only once on the basis of replacement costs. Like, for example, the first time the regulator starts setting tariffs in a certain way, or based on a certain new methodology or whatever. And then it gets updating using the method I described above. So basically, reduce it by depreciation and increase it by investments each year, including the start years for additional regulatory periods. And I have now switched to slide 44. And on the previous slide, I just explained that the regulator will set tariffs based on updated values of the regulatory asset base that will consider any additional investments. So the question here is, should all investments really be considered? So if we were to follow the general approach discussed so far, only efficient investments should be considered, and obviously that raises the question about what are efficient investments. And it turns out that how much a network should invest is the most difficult thing for a regulator. So when RPIX was brought around, the idea was that regulation was really easy. You just have to make your tariffs go down by 2% a year and then do nothing about it. But actually it is very difficult, because there are times when networks have to do very big investments, and there's questions about how much this investment should be, and it's really not automatic at all, and it's a very hands-on process. And renewables, for example, are very good examples of where situations when networks had to be adapted to be able to allow for renewables input. So like Germany, for example, has a lot of offshore wind in the north, and they needed to increase the transmission capacity from north to the south. And obviously, the additional investments required for this could not be captured with an RPIX. And finally now, after having stressed with it for 2 slides, I have indeed finished talking about the regulatory asset base in itself, though I will still talk shortly about 2 things that are directly related to it. So like I said, so far we've discussed the blue block on the left side of slide 37. But you will remember that I mentioned when I discussed that slide that these blue blocks serves to determine 2 components of a regulated company's required or allowed revenue. And those are the return on capital and then the depreciation or return of capital. And the idea behind this is the following. So let's say investors put money into an asset. So they pay 1,000 to purchase the network in this case. And then for their investment to be worth it to begin with, they will need to get this 1,000 back at some point. So this is what I refer to when I say return of capital. And this is it's what depreciation does basically. So if you assume a lifetime of 10 years for these specific assets, what this comes to say first place is that the investors need to recover this 1,000 at some point during this 10 years, and depreciation does that. In this case, linear depreciation. So by just looking at the number of years of lifetime would be equal to 100 each year, and each year the investor would recover 100 of the initial 1,000 that it paid. And by the end of the lifetime of the assets, it will have recovered the whole 1,000. So that would be the first thing. But then what is the issue with this? The issue with this is that receiving 100 each year is not equivalent to receiving 100 today due to 2 reasons. The first one is the time value of money. So the simple fact that money tomorrow is worth less than money today. And also the fact that there are risks associated with this investment. And that makes expecting to receive a certain amount of money in the future to be worth even less. So therefore, in addition to giving the investor back, simply the initial 1,000, you also need to give them back additional compensation to cover for this risk and time passage. And this is what the return on capital is. And I am now on slide 46, and slide 46 and 47, what they do is discuss in further detail the depreciation and the return on capital, but in interest of time, I'm going to skip through these 2 slides, and I'm going to pass soon straight to slide 48. However, what I will say very quickly is that one relevant issue for depreciation, in addition to the other complexities I discussed before, such as the fact that different assets may have different ages and lifetimes, is what should be considered to be the end of the lifetime of the asset base. So is it, let's call it technical lifetime. So basically the fact that, say, a new gas pipeline should last for 60 years, or is it economic lifetime? And I'll explain now what I mean by economic lifetime. So what happens if, for example, a gas pipeline is built in 2020 and it can last and it's meant to last for 60 years, but then decarbonization occurs by 2050 as planned and no one uses gas anymore. So in that case, should the company be able to recover its initial investment over less years? So until 2050 in this example, since obviously after 2050 it cannot anymore because there's no more users to charge tariffs to. And if it does that, of course will, so if it recovers over less years, then obviously that will mean higher tariffs over these fewer years. However, as long as this investment is needed, and at least from now until 2050, it seems reasonable that this company would be able to allow its investment in this shorter number of years. So like I said, I'm skipping otherwise through slide 46 and 47. And I have moved now on to slide 48. And so far we discussed the 2 bottom building blocks on the right-hand side column of slide 37. So depreciation and the return on capital. We also discussed how to determine the regulatory asset base. And the remaining building blocks therefore refer to operating costs, taxes, and other costs. And we will only discuss operating costs here since taxes are pretty straightforward, and the idea is simply to allow the company to still recover all these costs even after having to pay corporate tax. So what taxes are just a gross up of the required revenues to allow the company to pay corporate tax and still cover all its other allowed costs. And with respect to operating costs, As I mentioned before, this usually refers to maintenance contracts, repair costs, employee salaries, etc. And it is also a focus for the regulator to allow the company to recover only the operating costs that have been efficiently incurred. And I provided here on the slide a few examples of inefficiently incurred operating costs, such as cases where the company decided to purchase expensive cars for all its employees and hoping to pass the cost on to consumers, or maintenance contracts signed more expensive than, let's say, necessary, so more expensive than necessary in order to favor a relative, for example. I mean, you can think of a million examples of inefficient operating costs. But the idea is that it is usually much easier for the regulator to identify efficient operating costs than it is to identify efficient investments. And furthermore, well, benchmarking may be used more or less as a method to determine tariffs, or the whole required revenue for the company. It is definitely used a lot to set a level for efficient operating costs. So usually based on different metrics that can be cost per kilometer or cost per megawatt hour of capacity, for example. So that was the idea about operating costs, efficient operating costs, and slide 49 discusses further some efficiency issues regarding the mix between investments and operating cost decisions. But I will also skip it since we've discussed this in quite some detail by now, and also in interest of time, because I realize I'm running a little bit out of time. So I am now on slide 50, which discusses setting tariffs. So once the regulator determines the required revenue for the regulated company, it needs to decide how to share this required revenue between all the users of the network. And here I will only say that setting tariffs once the required revenue has been determined is rather complex, and I would say it's even a nerdy exercise. And I give you some examples on the slide. However, like I said, the focus of this lecture is actually on the required revenue rather than on tariffs. And with this ends our discussion about determining efficient compensation and setting efficient tariffs for regulated network companies. And we're also approaching the end of my part of this session. I only have to discuss very shortly the relevance of independent regulation, just in a couple of slides, and this will be my last topic, and I'm switching to this now. And I am now on slide 52. And like I said, I'm going to discuss shortly the importance of independent regulation. So you may know that every country in the EU has independent regulators. For example, CREG for energy in Belgium, Ofgem in UK for energy, Ofcom for telecoms, Ofwat for water, etc. So the question therefore is, why are these independent regulators needed? And sure, one explanation could be that there is a very specific knowledge that the regulator needs to develop, and that is true. But that is also knowledge that could be developed by a government. However, the real reason why independent regulation is needed has to do with something that economists call the hold-up problem. And the idea is that once an investor invests in an asset, so for example, once an investor purchases a network as part of the privatization process of that network, it has spent all this money that it will then need to recover via regulated tariffs that are set for the network. So what is the issue then with the government setting tariffs? The issue is that the higher the tariffs the government sets, the worse it will be for the consumers. And therefore, the government has incentives to set tariffs as low as possible. So once the investor has spent the initial amount of money, any tariffs that would cover only its operating costs would most likely allow it to stay in business. Well, unless it has debt for some of the money, but let's not get into that detail right now. Basically, let's just say that lower tariffs than needed for the investor to recover its initial investment might still allow it to stay in business and provide the service. So therefore, the government might have incentives to set tariffs that are lower than the tariffs that would allow the company to recover all these reasonably incurred costs, including the initial investment. And what this will do without proper guarantees is it will ultimately prevent investment or make it much more expensive. And therefore, a regulator that is independent from the government will help avoid this issue in theory. And I'm now on slide 53, which is my final slide. Like I said, the way you deal with the hold-up problem is by setting an independent regulator who is less likely to allow you less than fair tariffs. And that works theoretically very well, and in practice, it will depend on how independent the regulator really is. So, like, for example, the UK is known for the regulator's independence, but then otherwise, a part of the third energy package actually created some sort of incentives for regulator independence. So it mostly has to do with how the funding of the regulator is determined, and it's still not very clear how effective that is. So it's still to be seen. As I was saying, so with the independent regulation, we end my part of the session, and my colleague Boaz that you heard before will continue with the second part of this session later on in the spring, I believe. In the meantime, many thanks for listening, and again, I hope you're all well, and please feel free to drop me an email if you have any questions. I would be more than happy to reply, and it was great to do this session for you. Thank you very much.